we're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insight, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Friday, January 16th here in Seoul. I'm Isujin and this is News Generation. Joining us today is Ki.
Good morning, happy Friday.
Happy Friday. And also Cheska's with us.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So we finally made it to the end of the week, and today to close off the week, we're turning to a bit of a sensitive issue that's been drawing renewed attention right here in Korea, one that's prompting difficult questions about responsibility, history, and the role of the state in protecting children. So what's behind Korea's plan to phase out overseas adoption?
Sure. At the end of last December, the Korean government officially announced its decision to phase out and then the overseas adoption. The goal is to reduce the number of children sent abroad for adoption to 0 by 2029. The underlying principle is clear. Children born in Korea should, whenever possible, if possible, be raised within the country.
Right, so do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, just to add very quickly, starting back in July, Korean government made a pretty big shift in how adoptions are handled. So previously, private agencies were handling a lot of the adoption cases. Starting with back in July, government has decided that all adoption process involving international would be handled by the central government and local authorities. This means all the process involved in adoption will be going through the government, which is a quite big shift here in South Korea.
Right, that is quite a significant structural change, shifting adoption from private agencies to direct government oversight, which fundamentally alters how the system operates. So there's a lot to unpack here, so we're going to talk more about this. But first, let's take a look at the screen. International adoption of Korean children is a story that stretches back decades, shaped by war and social change. But now that long-standing system is facing a major turning point, with the South Korean government announcing plans to gradually phase out overseas adoption. Today on News Generation, we take a closer look at why the government is pushing for this change, why some groups and experts are raising concerns about these plans, and how this debate is likely to unfold in the years ahead. So as we just saw in the video, the story of international adoption in Korea is deeply tied to the nation's history and its complex relationship with family, identity, and social welfare. So let's go back to the origins of this practice. So Ki, when did Korea's overseas adoption begin and why did it begin?
Sure. The overseas adoption in Korea traces back to the aftermath of the Korean War, so 1950s. The war left behind a large number of orphans, and with the country devastated, destroyed, completely torn apart, Korea just simply did not have enough capacity to take care of them. And at the time, the government concluded that it would be better for these children to grow up with financially stable families overseas, and overseas adoption began as a result. As the practice continued, the number steadily increased, and in the 1970s, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 children were sent abroad each year, and by the 1980s, the figure rose to 7,000 to 8,000 annually. And in 1985 alone, an astonishing 8,837 Korean children were adopted overseas.
So those numbers really puts into perspective how overseas adoption began as an emergency response, but even as those numbers climbed, there were also growing concerns about whether this system should continue. And this has been going on for decades. So has the government before Cheska tried to put an end to this, and how have those efforts evolved over time?
Yeah, as Ki said, and Susan, as you mentioned, the government has been quite consistent in trying to sort of phase out the number of international adoptions. And they have tried every decade to put a new policy or new effort since the 1970s. So let's take a look at the screen to see the actual numbers change. And just to clarify a little bit, the term here, orphan, in Korea is a term being used to include children with no legally recognized guardianship, whether it be biological and or social. So as you can see, the number of children adopted overseas is going from a little over 100 in 2022 down to less than a half, 58 in 2024, and further down to just 24 last year. So you can definitely see the number of internationally adopted children phasing out over time.
So it's fascinating to hear how the government's decision was deeply influenced by the conditions of that time. And it's interesting to also hear that despite several attempts to phase it out, overseas adoption still continued, but we do see the numbers slowly decreasing in the recent years. So what exactly prompted the government to now push for a gradual end to this adoption?
Sure. So because there are problems that simply cannot be resolved by sending a child to what appears to be a better environment, many overseas adoptees have spoken about struggling with their cultural identity, experiencing racial discrimination, and facing restrictions on their right to find their biological parents. And for example, some overseas adoptees want to see their health record, not the family who sent them, but individual information is strictly protected here in Korea, and as the birth record has personal information about their biological parents, unless the parents agree to reveal, adoptees cannot access that information. And sometimes biological parents don't necessarily agree to open the information or don't want to contact their children because they're afraid, they feel guilty, or sometimes they don't even know the fact that they even exist. So some have even discovered that their identities were altered or that illegal practices were involved during the adoption process. And there's another important shift. Korean society has reached a point where there's a broad consensus that we're now capable or economically and institutionally of caring the children born on this land ourselves.
Right, so what you said really underscores a shift in Korea's ability to support these children domestically rather than relying on overseas families. So despite the government's intention, it's clear that Korea has become capable. Why is there still an argument against it, though?
Yeah, and I just like to preface that this is a very complex issue, and there are multiple sides to be considered. And whichever side you're arguing for, I think the real intention is what is the best for the children. So one of the sides that argue against it is that there are multiple perspectives involved. And the fact of the matter is Korea still has a very relatively low adoption rate domestically. And when they're not adopted and they can't remain with their biological parents, they have to end up in institutional care or orphanage, which ends up being one of the main reasons that some people oppose, because this policy shift is the belief that growing up with a family environment could actually be much better than being an institutional care system. Because many argue that for the children, it is always better to be surrounded by a stable permanent guardian that can provide stability, emotional wealth, and also stability from growing and guardianship throughout their lives.
So it definitely is a very complex issue. And what you said really highlights the core dilemma. The shared belief that growing up in a family matters most, even as a system meant to support that goal still remain quite limited. To see how the public feels about this, we asked our viewers directly, are you in favor of overseas or international adoption? So here's what the results showed. Majority of viewers, 58%, said they are conditionally in favor of overseas adoption, saying it may be necessary depending on the circumstances. 27% said they support international adoption outright, while 15% said they oppose it altogether. So what stands out is that most viewers aren't taking a hard yes or no position, and the strong conditional support suggests people are weighing children's immediate needs against longer-term concerns about the system. So we're going to gain a deeper, more personal insight into this issue. So we'll now hear from someone who was born in Korea and later adopted to the United States. And that conversation will take place right after the break, so don't go anywhere.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search out channel Arirang News. Click Posts and cast your vote in the poll. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is Yang Cheong-sik, who's also known as Jeff, who was born in Korea and later adopted by a family in the United States. So hello, thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Hi, thank you again for having me.
Right, so I'm really excited to talk to you about this. So to start, could you briefly, for our viewers, introduce yourself and tell us when you were adopted and where you grew up?
Sure. My name, Korean name is Cheong-sik Yang, or my adoptive name, Jeff. I was born in Seongnam-si, Taepyeongdong in March of '87, and I was prearranged for adoption before I was even born. I stayed in Korea for about 6 months due to pneumonia and just premature birth. And then I grew up with a family in upstate New York.
Wow, thanks for sharing your story. On a personal level, how do you feel about overseas adoption based on your own experience?
I mean, like you have said, it is a very complex, layered topic. I completely understand all the sides of how complex this is. I believe that it has to be stopped and overhauled. I do believe that there are instances in which adoption has to be considered and be the case, the benefit and the best case for the child. But going and educating myself, and luckily and lovingly my family, who are amazing, and I am so lucky to have been adopted by an understanding and ready to learn family about all about adoption, the truth about adoption, about my own true history, about how I came to be. But just knowing the pain that my community has gone through, I can't see it continuing in the way that it has been, which is why I am glad to see awareness increase. But I do think that more can be done.
Jeff, I think when it comes to policies that affect the lives of very specific situations, it is really important to hear from people's experience. So thank you for sharing. So based on that, from your experience, what would you say are some of the ways that the Korean government can support international adoptees?
I think, well, first is the continued work of the Truth and Reconciliation Council. There has still more cases to be investigated within that initial finding. I want a little bit more care and transparency in our records, which have been surrendered by the adoption agencies to the NCRC in July. But the actual physical care of these one-of-a-kind records, that's still under concern. We don't have necessarily an ease of access. When and if we return to Korea, that's on our own dime. We don't come with translators necessarily, but feeling just so everything has to be on the adoptee still. This work, when we return for the first time, not to have necessarily the support of the government, but this has to be our own work. So to see something a little bit more in terms of resources, ease, and maybe visa citizenship access, general education to the Korean public about not only adoptees, but about the conditions for birth parents, to end the stigma of single parents, of whatever reason, shame or guilt or whatever are true stories, just to ease that. I understand that just ending adoption does not fix or change or solve things. But to halt such a problematic industry and give time to really deep down fix and heal and try and find a better way forward, I think is hopefully in our future.
Before I let you go, because this is such an interesting story, you mentioned in your answer just now and also briefly earlier that you did speak to other adoptees and not everyone had an experience that you had as well. So what were some of the main challenges that they faced, do you think?
I mean, it's the vetting on both sides, not only Korea, but our adoptive countries. It's to ensure that the families that we have gone, that are we are being taken to, are good people. And like I said, that really horribly is not always the case. Having resources that understand what it means to be, in my case, one of the only Asian people in my entire town. I've been so many people's first Asian they've ever seen, let alone Korean, my entire life. And to how that feels to not go home and have a parent, if not both parents, of someone who looks like you or just of your culture, what it means other than just being the only one of you for an unknown reason. But it's a wide and varied range of experience, and we all feel differently. Some don't want to identify as Korean, which is perfectly fine. And some, like myself, have gone a little mental. But it's such a wide and varied, like you said, I can't speak for everybody, but I know the access to truth, the ease and availability, I think is what we wish for.
Right, I guess this is a very important discussion to continue having, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So we've just heard from a Korean-born adoptee raised in the U.S. who offered us a personal perspective on Korea's overseas adoption debate. So that brings us back to a key policy question. So for Korea to actually move towards ending overseas adoption, what needs to happen first, Keen?
Sure. So the most effective approach is to ensure that children can be raised within their biological families. In reality, roughly 99% of children adopted overseas are born to unmarried mothers. If you take a look at the screen now, according to the Ministry of Health and Welfare, the share of overseas adoptees from unmarried mothers reached a whopping 100% in 2019, 99.6% in 2020, and 99.5% in 2021. So it's very different than early 1980s. This underscores a critical point. So through stronger economic and social support, along broader changes in public perception, we must create a childcare environment where raising a child is genuinely possible, even outside the framework of the conventional marriage.
So this points to a structural issue that overseas adoption is closely tied to lack of support for single mothers here in Korea. But when remaining with the birth family is impossible, what alternatives need to be strengthened, Cheska?
I think he mentioned something important. I think perception is sort of the foundation for everything.
Right.
Because here in South Korea, still, the rate of domestic adoption is very, very low compared to other countries. So that must definitely be strengthened if we are going to close the doors on international adoptions or make the process harder. But if that can't be the immediate solution, I think the next relevant step is foster care system. Because here in Korea, as we mentioned before, if you're not adopted, you're automatically put into institutional care or orphanage. And sometimes it is much better to have a foster family that can provide you with a stability and safety, both emotionally and physically. Because at least they will have a permanent guardian who can guide through a very, very formative period of their lives. So I do believe that foster care system is something that Korea could adopt and also use quite immediately to support these kind of children. Yeah.
And I think this issue is so difficult because like in Korea, culturally, blood is really important as well. So there's also that stigma as well. So the options are still quite limited, which is why strengthening domestic adoption and foster care isn't just a policy choice, but a real necessity if overseas adoption is to be phased out. So with so many unresolved challenges and past attempts falling short, this debate is clearly far from over. So looking ahead, Ki, how do you see this discussion unfolding and what will it take for this time to be different?
Sure. I've been hosting this event called the Overseas Korean Adoptees Gathering, hosted by the Overseas Korean Agency for the past 5 years or so, twice a year. Those adopted overseas people, with whatever reason, they come to mother country for a visit, experience the food and culture, learn about their legal procedures related to them, provided by the Ministry of Justice, all sorts of different agencies and other related institutions, and have a deep discussion about how to protect them. And all throughout 4 or 5 days of the events, I heard all different sorts of stories like Jeff shared, personally or at an open discussion. People share their concerns and people even cry. And the common topic that rises all the time is the lack of personnel in charge of helping them. There are literally hundreds and thousands of adoptees around the world, and only 40 to 50 people from the government are in charge of the matter. So systematically, we're just shorthanded, and hopefully we can raise concern more publicly so more people can actually pay attention.
Right, because these people are coming to a country that they don't know anything about, so having people to help them on the ground is really important.
Exactly. They don't even speak Korean, so it's
Jeff,
all new for them.
And Jeff mentioned that they have to hire a translator and find all these things. So if there can be a little bit of more support, or at least a bridge for them to cross and maybe get to the information they need, it might actually turn out to be better.
I agree. So do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, like he said, I have also worked closely with adopted friends and families. And I think when you approach a situation of lives that we have not experienced, we really have to go with a lot of compassion and open-hearted. Because as Key mentioned, as Jeff mentioned, every story is vastly different. The conclusion that I've come to is while we all have the same intention, the best intention, of course, for these type of situations and people, I don't necessarily think it is whether the nationality of the adoption that matters, but more the process. Because I think every children do want a loving and supportive family. But what is the exact process that can support them to get to that kind of guardianship, protection, and safety might not necessarily have to do with nationality. Because as Jeff mentioned, if there wasn't a proper protection for these children going internationally or domestically, then it doesn't matter where they go. Wherever they end up, they wouldn't be able to necessarily receive the protection and the care.
Yeah, which is why listening to their stories is also really important as well. So as Korea moves towards ending overseas adoption, the challenge now lies in building the systems needed to ensure every child can grow up in a safe and supportive family environment, and the best choice would be right here at home. Because at the heart of this debate are the children and the question of how best to protect their rights and futures in the years ahead. So whether this latest effort succeeds is not just about ending overseas adoption, but whether viable domestic alternatives can be put in place in time. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation. But News Gen will be back on Monday at 10:30 a.m. Korea time with more stories and discussions. And a big thanks to Key.
Thank you.
For coming in, also Cheska.
Pleasure's always mine, thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have the best weekend. We are News Generation.